This is my new project bike. It is a 1972 FX1200 Shovelhead, also known as a Super Glide, and it certainly doesn't look like a Super Glide. And the reason for that is the previous owner has whacked FLH tins on the bike as well as an FLH front end. It is running a 79 cowpie transmission. It also has a 73 FX1200 engine in it with oversized cylinders, and my plans with this bike is to turn it into a chopper, and I'm not going to feel guilty for doing so, as this is already a bit of a Frankenstein bike. And in this video, I'm going to be replacing the transmission seals on my Shovelhead, as I've got a pretty bad leak coming from behind my countershaft sprocket. First off is to drain all the oil from the primary. Next up is to remove the 8 bolts from the outer primary cover so we can remove it. Once the primary is off, we can remove the clutch springs and the clutch plates. Now to remove the large nut which secures the clutch hub. And I noticed when we removed this nut I was missing my clutch hub tab washer, so I had to buy another one of them. Now we're just removing the clutch rod, and here I noticed my Shovelhead isn't running a compensator, so I have gone ahead and bought a compensating sprocket to return the primary drive to its stock configuration. Here we're just removing a bolt which secures the primary chain tensioner to the inner primary housing. Once we remove the primary chain tensioner, we can remove the whole unit. Now whilst I was filming on this side of the bike removing the exhaust and the battery tray to access the starter motor, my father-in-law went ahead and removed the clutch hub, and he had to use a hub puller to do so. I also didn't get a chance to film my father-in-law removing the bolts on the inner primary as well as removing the starter motor. You gotta watch him, he gets carried away and can't help himself once he starts wrenching. With the inner primary case removed, we could access the transmission sprocket, and we just had to knock down the tabs on the lock washer, then remove the large nut, followed by removing the joiner link in the chain, and then we were able to remove the sprocket from the transmission. Now at some stage I had a look under the bike and looked at my transmission drain bolt, and I found that there was 2 small cracks in the housing right near the drain plug, and that's a telltale sign of someone over tightening your drain bolt and cracking your casing. So now what we have to do is remove the whole transmission and weld up those small cracks. Now to remove the crankshaft seal and the old crankshaft spacer. Now we've removed the seals that need replacing, we're going to go ahead and remove the transmission. So to remove the transmission, we need to remove the oil bag, or if you're an Aussie, remove the oil tank. And clearly it's been a while since the oil has been changed, as it more or less resembles sludge. After removing the oil tank, now we can remove the transmission, and we just have to loosen off the 5 bolts which mount the transmission to the frame from underneath. And we also had to remove the swing arm axle so we could pivot the swing arm out of the way and remove the transmission. Now while we had the transmission off the bike, I thought it'd be wise to go ahead and take the top off the transmission and inspect all the gears and the shift forks to make sure I had no damage. And thank God the transmission was in really good condition. All good? Yeah. So after popping the top back on the transmission, we can repair the crack in the housing right where the drain bolt goes. So we've discovered there are 2 cracks, one that's quite visible that you can see here, and there's another little hairline crack that runs there. So my father-in-law is just using a small Dremel to open up the cracks, so when he welds it up, the weld has something to really bite into and fill those cracks. As you guessed it, the father-in-law does not have a TIG welder, but he's just using some aluminium rods with an oxyacetylene torch, and it did the job just fine. Of course we tidied up the bird shit weld with a flapper disc on a grinder, and it looked a lot better afterwards. Next up was to replace the transmission seals and the main crankshaft seal, along with the spacers that go behind those seals. It's extremely important when replacing these seals that you do replace the spacers, as the old seals wear a groove into those spacers, and if you install new seals on those old spacers, they're still going to leak. After applying some installation grease onto the spacers and the seals, they're right to go into the transmission housing. Now, I didn't have a sprocket or pole long enough to go over the countershaft, and if you take your time and go around the seal evenly with the square bar, you can get it in nice and square. And I am certain there will be someone out there that has a problem with this method, but hey, it worked for us.
That's all the way in.
Now, we did have to knock this gearbox main seal in with some metal tubing, but of course I didn't get to film that. But here you can see it seated nicely and isn't damaged.
We'll put the sprocket on the right way this time.
You can see where it's been wearing on the casing. The previous owner had this on back to front. After putting the sprocket on, we needed to install the super nut, and what the super nut does is just adds an extra seal in front of the sprocket to prevent your main shaft from leaking oil from that main seal, if that makes any sense. So there is no way we're going to be able to hold this down and torque down that sprocket nut to 100 foot-pound, so we're going to mount the transmission back in the frame so we can get some torque on that nut. To stop the sprocket from spinning when we torque down the super nut, we went ahead and reinstalled the chain. Then I put my foot on the rear brake whilst my father-in-law torqued the super nut to spec. Next was to install the main crankshaft seal and the new spacer. And as you can see, it looks like I'm installing my seal in backwards as the open side is facing out. And the reason is because if you're running a wet primary like I am, this is the direction the seal needs to go. After the main crankshaft seal and spacer was installed, we cleaned the stator rotor as it was covered in an oily residue. The magnet's grabbed it.
That's why I didn't have my finger in behind it.
After installing the seals, we focused our attention on the primary components, being the clutch hub and clutch plates. And as you can see here, my clutch hub is in very poor condition, as the mounting studs, also known as fingers, have extremely deep grooves in them. And this could cause all kinds of problems with your clutch engagement. So I figured I needed to go ahead and buy a new clutch hub and some new clutch plates. And this is where I realized the repair on my Shovelhead got quite expensive. So I'm going to break down the cost in parts. First off, the new seals and spacers cost me $163. Then the super nut cost me $87. The gasket kit for the primary cost me $82 when you factor in the cost of postage. The clutch plates cost me $171. The compensator kit, which the previous owner got rid of, cost me $238. I also bought a new clutch basket, which cost $445, as the previous owner had done a pretty dodgy repair trying to weld up the back of the clutch basket. And finally, the clutch hub that I needed to replace cost me $198. And here we're installing a new needle bearing into the outer primary cover for the starter motor, and that cost another $20. And that brings the total cost of this repair to $1,404. Quite crazy when all I thought I had to do was repair the transmission seals. Anyway, moving on. Whilst I was looking on the inside of the primary cover, I realised the previous owner had removed the stock chain oiler and had plugged it off. So because I'm running a wet primary and want to have a vent into my wet primary so the case doesn't pressurize, I went and bought the stock chain oiler, which I'm going to press back into the casing and run a vent line off. So here is the stock chain oiler, which arrived in the mail, and now we're going to try and press fit it into my inner primary cover. As you can see, the chain oiler is an extremely loose fit into the inner primary cover. So what my father-in-law did was press fit a piece of copper tubing onto the chain oiler. Then he drilled out an appropriate sized hole into the inner primary and then press fit the chain oiler into it. And by press fit, I mean he whacked the shit out of it. So here you can see the chain oiler has a nice press fit into the inner primary, and what I'm going to do is just apply some adhesive to prevent any oil from weeping past that fit. Next was to install a vent hose onto the stock chain oiler. As I said previously, the whole purpose of running this chain oiler is to have a vent for my wet primary. Next was to replace the stock inner primary seal. We had a look at the bearing and that was in really good condition, so we didn't need to replace it. After tapping in the new inner primary seal, I went and installed the O-ring which goes in between your inner primary and your crankcase. And yes, I know I'm only doing the little jobs, but hey, someone's got to operate the camera. Well, at least that's what I'm going to tell myself. Now we're installing a new gasket on the starter housing. Next was to reinstall the inner primary cover, then tighten all the bolts down to spec, and of course, because we're backyard technicians, we just tighten them down to feel. Tight is tight, right? After whacking some lube on the starter drive, it was time to put it in the hole. Then the starter solenoid, which we're putting a new gasket on here, and the starter solenoid is installed with 2 bolts and a spacer. On goes the compensator extension, then the wood rough key. Now we get to install the brand new clutch hub, followed by the clutch tab lock washer, then the clutch hub nut, which we're replacing the seal to here. When installing the clutch hub nut, we went and used an air compressed impact driver. I know that's going to upset a lot of people, but it's just the easiest way to do it because the clutch hub wants to spin when you try and torque it. Now we just had to bend over the tabs to the lock washer. Next was to install the brand new clutch basket and the new compensator. Here we're just fitting the chain tensioner by hand. And these Energy One Kevlar clutch plates can be run wet or dry, so it's not going to be an issue that I'm pre-soaking them. In fact, the installation manual recommends that you pre-soak them. And it's also not going to be an issue as I'm running a wet primary and the plates will get drenched in oil anyway. Next was to install my clutch push rod with the rounded dome surface going in. After installing the nuts onto the clutch springs, we can go ahead and remove the homemade washer, which we put on the clutch basket to compress the springs. Now with the clutch rod adjustment screw, you just have to wind it in until it's nice and firm and seated, then back it out a quarter of a turn, then tighten the lock nut. Next was to install the rest of the compensator, and I'm applying some blue Loctite inside the compensator locking nut. And again, we're going to buzz the lock nut down with an air compressed rattle gun. After that, I'm going to go ahead and install these spacers on the starter drive. Next up was to set my primary chain tension, and the slack your primary chain should have is no more than 3/4 of an inch. Here I'm applying some gasket glue on the inner and outer primary cover, and I'm also running a gasket between the two. After reinstalling the primary cover, battery tray and exhaust, it was time to fill the bike up with oil. For the engine oil which goes in the oil tank, I'm just using 4 quarts of 50 weight Spectro oil. And of course I installed a new oil filter into the tank. And for the transmission, I'm going to use some heavy shockproof transmission oil from Redline, and the manual calls for 710 ml of transmission oil, but the best way to check the transmission level is via the weep hole. When filling the transmission, I went ahead and slowly poured it into the funnel, because if you pour it too fast, it's not going to have a chance to settle in the transmission and it'll come through that weep hole before the transmission's full. So I've just got this on a time lapse, as it took quite a while to pour all the transmission oil into the transmission. Once the transmission fluid started leaking out of the weep hole, I reinstalled the grub screw and then I moved on to the primary. First off was to reinstall the primary drain plug, which I put a new rubber O-ring on. And as you can see, the oil that I'm going to be running in my primary is the Spectro heavy duty primary chain case oil. And my primary case only needed 450 ml of oil. And finally, the last thing I needed to do was reinstall the derby cover. So on goes a new gasket and derby cover. And voila, she's finally done. Finally. So that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.